homeless orphan girl gave away the last money she had to save a dying old man everyone else ignored. She thought she was helping a lonely stranger. She was wrong. The old man was secretly the father of one of America's most powerful billionaires. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what happened after. Because one unexpected act of kindness from this homeless young woman would change the fate of an entire billionaire family, spark a vicious war over a fortune worth billions, expose dangerous secrets, and make a powerful billionaire fall deeply in love with the one-woman society treated like she was nothing. Soon, the people who mocked her would wish they had never crossed her path. The people who humiliated her would beg for mercy. And the billionaire who first looked down on her would eventually risk everything to protect her. But how could a homeless orphan girl capture the heart of a billionaire without even trying? Why was the dying old man hiding his true identity? And what secret was buried inside a sealed document that could destroy one of the richest families in America forever? This is the story of Emily Carter. Emily Carter had no idea her life was only days away from colliding with one of the richest families in America. At 25 years old, she owned less than most people spent on a dinner. Everything she possessed fit inside a faded backpack, 3 shirts, 1 pair of shoes, a few photographs, and a worn silver locket she had carried since childhood. The locket was the only thing she had left from her parents. Whenever life became unbearable, she opened it and stared at their smiling faces. It reminded her that she had once been loved. As Emily walked through downtown Dallas, the city buzzed with life around her. Luxury cars rolled past. Executives hurried between meetings. Wealth seemed to surround her everywhere she looked, yet she felt invisible. A flashback drifted through her mind. 9-year-old Emily sat alone in a hospital waiting room while a social worker gently explained that her parents weren't coming back. The drunk driver who caused the accident survived. Her parents didn't. The memory still hurt. Years later, foster homes had taught her another painful lesson. People often treated vulnerable children as burdens. Some foster parents were decent. Others saw her as unpaid help. By 18, she had learned to depend on no one. Yet somehow, despite all the pain, kindness remained alive inside her. That kindness confused people. Many believed suffering should create bitterness. Instead, Emily chose compassion. Unfortunately, compassion didn't pay rent. Her stomach growled as she entered Brighton Jewelers, where she worked temporary shifts. The store sparkled with diamonds worth more than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. "Morning, Emily," a coworker said. "Morning." Manager barely looked at her. Temporary workers came and went to him. She was replaceable. Still, Emily worked diligently. She greeted customers, organized displays, helped elderly shoppers. Everything seemed normal, until a scream shattered the atmosphere. My wealthy woman dressed in designer clothing stood near the display cases. "My diamond bracelet is gone." Customers turned immediately. Employees rushed over. The woman's eyes scanned the room, then settled on Emily. Emily blinked. "Excuse me, you took it." Store became silent. "I didn't take anything." Woman crossed her arms. "Then where is it?" The manager hurried over. His eyes moved between the rich customer and the poor employee. Without realizing it, he had already chosen a side. "Emily, empty your pockets." She obeyed. "Nothing." "Open your bag." Again nothing. But suspicion had already infected the room. Whispers spread. A customer shook his head. Another moved away from her. The wealthy woman smirked slightly. A subtle expression Emily didn't notice, but the audience would later remember it. The manager sighed. "I'm sorry, Emily." "What? I think it's best if you leave." Tears formed instantly. "You know I didn't steal anything." "Can't risk upsetting customers." The words cut deeply. Not because she lost the job, because no one believed her. The woman watched with satisfaction as Emily gathered her belongings. A tiny clue hidden in plain sight, a clue that would matter much later. Outside, Emily sat briefly on a bench. Humiliation weighed heavily on her chest. Across town, in a glass skyscraper overlooking the city, 34-year-old Alexander Whitmore ended a meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Unlike Emily, Alexander possessed everything money could buy: private jets, luxury estates, global influence, a fortune approaching $12 billion. Yet happiness remained strangely absent from his life. As executives left the boardroom, Alexander stared out the window. A brief flashback surfaced. Years earlier, after his mother's death, countless people had entered his life claiming to care about him. Most disappeared once they realized what they couldn't gain. That experience had hardened him. Now he trusted very few people. One of those people was his father, Henry Whitmore. What Alexander didn't know was that Henry had recently begun questioning the loyalty of almost everyone around him, including Alexander's fiancée, Vanessa Sinclair. Henry had noticed things others missed. Vanessa asking detailed questions about inheritance structures. Vanessa becoming unusually interested in family trusts. Vanessa treating employees kindly only when powerful people were watching. Tiny clues, tiny warning signs, nothing conclusive, yet enough to worry him. Those observations had inspired a decision, a dangerous decision, one that would soon place him directly in Emily's path. Back on the streets, Emily continued walking. She had no job, almost no money, and nowhere permanent to sleep. Yet she still found herself helping a lost tourist find directions. The tourist smiled. "Thank you. You're welcome." Emily continued onward. Moments later, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench across the street. At first glance, he seemed ordinary. Neatly dressed, quiet, respectable, but something felt wrong. His hands trembled, his breathing became uneven, then suddenly he collapsed. People stopped briefly, looked, and kept moving. A businessman stepped around him. A couple pretended not to notice. Someone muttered, "Not my problem." Emily froze. The rational part of her reminded her she had nothing left. No job, no money, no future security. But another voice inside her was louder. The same voice that had survived every foster home, every humiliation, every heartbreak. The voice that refused to stop caring. She sprinted across the street. "Sir." The old man's eyes opened weakly. For a split second, fear flickered inside them, then pain. "Can you hear me?" No response, only labored breathing. Emily looked around desperately. "Help, somebody help." Nobody stopped. The crowd continued moving. The sight would later haunt Henry Whitmore. Because in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, only one person cared whether he lived or died. A homeless orphan girl. Emily removed her worn jacket and wrapped it around him. Then she reached into her pocket, a $20 bill. Her last $20, the money meant for food, the money meant for survival. She stared at it, then quietly handed it to a taxi driver. "Help me get him to a hospital." The driver nodded. Together they lifted the old man inside. As the taxi pulled away, Henry's fatting eyes studied the young woman beside him. Confusion crossed his face. Why would someone with so little sacrifice so much? The question echoed through his mind as darkness consumed him. Neither of them realized that this single moment would ignite a chain of events capable of destroying empires, exposing betrayals, and changing both their lives forever. And somewhere in another part of the city, Alexander Whitmore's phone suddenly rang. The call came from the hospital. The caller ID made his blood run cold. It was about his father. Alexander Whitmore stared at the hospital caller ID for half a second before answering. A strange feeling settled in his chest. His father rarely called anyone for help. Henry Whitmore had always been the strongest person in the room. Even at 76, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built empires, survived corporate wars, and buried more betrayals than most people would experience in a lifetime. "Mr. Whitmore?" a nurse said. "Yes." "Your father was admitted a short while ago." Alexander immediately stood. "What happened?" He collapsed downtown. The first time in months, genuine fear crossed his face. "I'm on my way." As he rushed toward the elevator, he never imagined the person responsible for saving his father's life was a homeless orphan who had just sacrificed her last $20. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, Henry Whitmore slowly opened his eyes. The room was quiet. Machines beeped softly. For several moments, he simply stared at the ceiling. Fragments of memory returned. The bench, the dizziness, the crowd, the faces that looked away. Then another face appeared in his memory, a young woman, tired eyes, worn clothes, a kindness that seemed impossible in a world increasingly obsessed with status and wealth. He turned toward a nurse. Girl, the young woman who brought me here." Nurse smiled. "Oh, her. Where is she?" "She stayed until she knew you were stable." Henry looked surprised. "She did?" The nurse nodded. "She seemed genuinely worried about you." The old billionaire remained silent. For years he had watched people compete for his attention, fight for invitations, fight for influence, fight for money. Yet the one person who seemed to care had absolutely nothing to gain. That thought stayed with him. A subtle seed was planted, one that would eventually change everything. Hours later, Alexander arrived. The reunion was brief but emotional. "You scared me," Alexander said. Henry chuckled weakly. "Good." Alexander frowned. "Now you'll visit more often." Despite his wealth and power, Alexander suddenly looked like a son again, a small glimpse beneath the billionaire exterior. After the doctor left, Henry asked a simple question. "The hospital mention who brought me here?" "No, a young woman." Alexander nodded absent-mindedly. "Then we'll send her something." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the response bothered him, not because Alexander was ungrateful, because he immediately assumed kindness should be compensated with money. That observation quietly joined dozens of others Henry had been collecting, not evidence, just clues, foreshadowing, questions, the kind that kept an old man awake at night. The next morning, Emily returned to the hospital. She wasn't sure why, perhaps because she remembered sitting alone in hospitals after her parents died, perhaps because she knew what loneliness felt like. Whatever the reason, she showed up carrying a library book she had borrowed. One of the nurses smiled. "Back. How is he?" "Better." A few minutes later, Henry saw her entering the room. For a moment, he simply watched. She looked exhausted. Her clothes were clean but clearly old. The straps on her backpack had been repaired multiple times. Small details wealthy people rarely noticed. But Henry noticed everything. "You came back." Emily smiled. "Of course." "Why?" The question surprised her. "Because I wanted to make sure you're okay." Henry studied her face carefully. No hidden agenda, no expectation, no calculation. Just sincerity. It reminded him painfully of someone, his late wife. A woman who had loved him long before wealth entered their lives. For a brief moment, a flashback surfaced. A tiny apartment, cheap furniture, young Henry and young Margaret eating takeout on the floor because they couldn't afford a dining table. Back then, love had been simple, pure, before money complicated everything. The memory faded. "You never told me your name," Henry said. "Emily." "I'm Henry." Neither mentioned the Whitmore name. That omission was intentional. Henry wanted to know who Emily would be when she wasn't influenced by wealth. Over the following weeks, Emily visited regularly, whenever she could, sometimes after searching unsuccessfully for work, sometimes after spending nights in abandoned places, sometimes while hiding her own struggles. She brought books, shared stories, played chess, listened. The hospital staff began noticing something unusual. The old man seemed happier whenever Emily appeared. One afternoon, a nurse accidentally handed Emily a folder. "I think this belongs in room 407. Emily glanced down. Medical bills. She intended to return them immediately. Then she saw the amount, $90,000. Her eyes widened. The figure felt impossible. She looked toward Henry's room. A wave of sadness hit her. She remembered the foster homes, the elderly residents she'd met while working temporary jobs, the people forgotten by everyone. A dangerous assumption formed. She believed Henry was alone. The audience knew something she didn't. Henry Whitmore could pay that bill 1,000 times over. But because he had hidden his identity, Emily saw only an elderly man fighting illness without family support. That misunderstanding became the foundation of the most important decision in the story. The next day, Emily disappeared. Henry waited. No visit, no phone call, nothing. For the first time, disappointment crept into his thoughts. Maybe he had misjudged her. Maybe she had simply moved on. The feeling surprised him more than he cared to admit. Late the following morning, the door opened. Emily entered holding a plain envelope. She looked nervous. Henry immediately noticed. "What is it?" Emily swallowed hard, then handed him the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Henry stared. "What is this?" "I know it isn't much." His eyes moved to the amount, $4,700, every penny she owned. He looked up slowly. Emily smiled sadly. "I saw the medical bills." The room became silent. "I figured you might need help." Henry's hands froze. For several seconds he couldn't speak. The audience could, because the flashbacks now connected. The foster homes, the loneliness, the hunger, the struggle, everything had led to this moment, not because Emily was naive, because she understood abandonment better than anyone. "You want to give me this?" Henry finally asked. She nodded. "It took years to save." The words landed like a hammer. Years of sacrifice, years of skipped meals. Years of surviving, and she was handing it away. Henry felt his throat tight. No board member had ever done this. No relative, no business partner, no so-called friend. A homeless orphan had just offered him everything. Unknown to Emily, a decision formed inside Henry's mind at that exact moment. A life-changing decision, one he wouldn't reveal yet, because first he needed to know something. Was Emily truly this selfless, or was she simply extraordinary in ways the world had failed to recognize? Across town, another person was beginning to notice Henry's growing attachment to someone. A beautiful woman named Vanessa Sinclair, Alexander Whitmore's fiancée, the future Mrs. Whitmore, or so she believed. Standing inside the Whitmore mansion, Vanessa overheard part of a conversation between Henry and a family attorney. She caught only a few words, enough to make her curious, enough to make her suspicious, enough to begin asking questions that would eventually turn Emily Carter's life into a nightmare. And as Vanessa stared out the mansion window, a cold smile slowly appeared on her face. She didn't know who Emily was yet, but she was about to find out. Vanessa Sinclair had spent years perfecting one skill. 3 days after the disastrous coffee incident, Emily sat outside a workforce center scanning job listings that seemed determined to reject her. Every application ended the same way: no openings, no callbacks, no opportunities. The false theft accusation from Brighton Jewelers had spread farther than she realized. Several businesses had quietly shared information. Nobody said it openly. Nobody needed to. A poor woman accused of theft became guilty in many people's minds long before facts appeared. Emily folded the paper and stared into the distance. Her savings were gone. Her last stable job was gone. Her future looked increasingly uncertain. Yet she still found herself thinking about Henry. The old man would probably need another library book. The thought made her smile. At that exact moment, events were unfolding elsewhere. Inside Brighton Jewelers, the manager sat frozen in front of security footage. He had watched it 6 times, then 10, then 15. The result never changed. The wealthy customer had stolen her own bracelet. Frame by frame, the footage showed her removing the bracelet, placing it inside her purse, and then accusing Emily minutes later. The manager felt sick. His hands trembled. The memory of Emily begging him to believe her replayed endlessly. "You know I didn't do this." She had been telling the truth, and he had thrown her away. An hour later, he picked up his phone. "Find Emily Carter. We've been trying. Try harder." What should we tell her? The manager swallowed heavily. The truth. Across town, Henry Whitmore had finally left the hospital and returned to one of his private residences. Not the mansion where Alexander and Vanessa frequently visited. A smaller estate, quiet, private, the kind of place where he could think. For years, Henry had studied people. Success had taught him something valuable. Character revealed itself most clearly when nobody was watching. And Emily's character had revealed itself repeatedly. The $20, the hospital visits, the $4,700, the countless acts of kindness. Each piece formed part of a growing picture. The image became impossible to ignore. A flashback surfaced. 25-year-old Henry Whitmore standing outside a factory decades earlier after losing his first business. His pockets were empty. His dreams appeared shattered. Only one person had stood beside him, Margaret, his future wife. She believed in him before the wealth arrived, before the success, before the world cared. The memory explained something important. Henry wasn't simply fond of Emily. She reminded him of values he feared had disappeared, values money could never purchase. That realization pushed him toward a dangerous decision, one that would soon send shockwaves through his family. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself behaving strangely. He checked hospital updates more often, asked about Emily occasionally, wondered whether she was still visiting his father. The curiosity irritated him. He barely knew her, yet something about her lingered in his thoughts. Perhaps it was because she treated Henry with genuine care. Perhaps it was because she seemed completely indifferent to wealth. Or perhaps it was because her disappointed expression after the coffee incident kept replaying in his mind. Whatever the reason, she was becoming harder to forget. Unfortunately, someone else was thinking about Emily too. Vanessa Sinclair. And unlike Alexander, her interest was far from innocent. Inside her luxury penthouse, she reviewed fresh reports from her investigator. Every page increased her frustration. Emily possessed nothing, no wealth, no social status, no influential connections. Yet Henry Whitmore kept spending time with her. That made no sense. And things she couldn't understand made her dangerous. Because fear was beginning to replace curiosity. The fear intensified later that afternoon. Henry met privately with his attorney. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Vanessa couldn't hear the discussion, but she saw the attorney leave carrying documents, important documents. Her instincts immediately screamed that something was wrong, very wrong. Elsewhere, Emily's phone suddenly rang. She looked down at the unfamiliar number. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded nervous. Emily, this is Mark Reynolds from Brighton Jewelers. Her stomach tightened instantly. The humiliation returned. What do you want? Silence then. We owe you an apology. Emily frowned. What? The security footage was reviewed. Another pause, this one heavier. You never stole anything. Emily closed her eyes. For several moments she couldn't speak. Months of pain crashed into her all at once. The lost income, the humiliation, the judgment, the hunger, the hopelessness, all because someone lied. Like you to come in. No, Emily, no. She ended the call. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Not because she was sad. Because the truth had arrived too late. The damage was already done. That evening, Vanessa decided she was finished watching from a distance. If Emily represented a threat, she intended to eliminate that threat immediately. The opportunity came sooner than expected. After leaving a public library, Emily walked through a nearly empty parking garage. The concrete structure echoed with footsteps. She didn't notice the black SUV parked nearby. She didn't notice the men watching her. Not until it was too late. One stepped directly into her path. Another appeared behind her. Emily stopped. What do you want? Neither answered. Then a familiar voice echoed through the garage. Leave us. Vanessa Sinclair emerged from the shadows, elegant, perfectly dressed, cold. Emily frowned. Know you? No. Vanessa smiled faintly. But I know you. Men moved closer. Emily instinctively stepped back. What is this? Vanessa looked her up and down. Disgust flashed briefly across her face. Become very popular lately. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? Vanessa's voice sharpened. Henry Whitmore. Emily froze. For the first time she recognized the name Whitmore, the same last name as the billionaire she'd heard mentioned on television countless times. The realization confused her. Vanessa noticed. You didn't know. Emily's heart began racing. What are you talking about? Vanessa laughed softly, a cruel sound. You honestly thought he was just some lonely old man. Pieces started connecting. The hospital, the secrecy, the wealth. The attorneys, the strange questions. Before Emily could process everything, one of the men grabbed her backpack. Its contents spilled across the concrete floor: books, photographs, personal belongings, the silver locket, the receipt showing her $4,700 cashier's check. Vanessa picked it up, her eyes narrowed. For the first time, genuine alarm crossed her face. The amount wasn't important. The sacrifice was. Henry would never ignore something like this. Which meant Emily's influence might be deeper than she feared. You think people like you belong near people like us? Vanessa asked coldly. Emily lifted her chin. I never asked for anything. That's exactly the problem. Men stepped closer. Emily suddenly realized she was trapped. No witnesses, no help, no escape. The tension became unbearable, and right at that explosive moment, backhand. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel right now and comment below where you're watching from. Because what happens next changes everything, and trust me, the revenge coming in part 2 will leave you speechless. Backhand. Vanessa moved forward. Stay away from Henry. I don't understand what's happening. You don't need to. Another step. Disappear. Emily's pulse thundered, then suddenly headlights exploded across the garage. A black Rolls-Royce roared into the parking structure. Tires screeched. Everyone turned. The rear door opened. A tall figure stepped out. Alexander Whitmore. The atmosphere changed instantly. Vanessa's confidence vanished. The men retreated. Alexander's expression was ice cold. His eyes moved from Vanessa to the frightened Emily, to the scattered belongings on the ground. The silence became terrifying. Then he spoke quietly, dangerously. Would someone like to explain? His gaze locked onto Vanessa. Why my father's favorite person in the world is being threatened. Nobody answered. Nobody could. Emily stood frozen. Vanessa looked trapped. And Alexander's anger continued growing. But none of them knew the biggest shock had already happened. Earlier that day, Henry Whitmore had signed a sealed legal document, a document hidden inside a secure safe, a document prepared by his attorney. The final pages contained a name, not Alexander Whitmore, not Vanessa Sinclair, not any member of the Whitmore family, one name, one impossible name, Emily Carter. And as the safe door slowly closed, a devastating inheritance war was quietly beginning. A war that would bring betrayals, humiliation, love, revenge, and enough secrets to destroy an empire, to be continued in part 2. She knew how to become exactly what powerful people wanted to see. To the media she was elegant, to charity boards she was compassionate, to socialites she was charming, to Alexander Whitmore she appeared loyal. But beneath the carefully crafted image lived a woman obsessed with one thing above all else: security, power, control. The Whitmore fortune represented all three. That was why the conversation she overheard days earlier refused to leave her mind. Henry Whitmore rarely spoke privately with family attorneys, and when he did, important decisions usually followed. As she stood inside the Whitmore mansion's enormous living room, fragments of the discussion replayed in her head. Deserves protection. Good character. Future considerations. The words seemed harmless, yet something about Henry's tone had unsettled her. Meanwhile, Henry sat inside a private hospital suite smiling at a chessboard. Emily had just defeated him again. "Think you're cheating," Henry complained. Emily laughed. "That's what you said last time. The time before that. The time before that." The old man chuckled. For several moments neither spoke. An unusual peace filled the room. Henry had spent decades surrounded by executives, lawyers, politicians, and investors. Most conversations carried hidden agendas. Emily's never did. That alone made her extraordinary. A subtle foreshadowing appeared when Henry noticed a small tear in her sleeve, then another on her backpack, tiny details, evidence she was struggling far more than she admitted. Yet she never complained, never asked for help, never hinted at wanting anything. The more Henry observed her, the more questions formed. How could someone endure so much hardship and remain kind? The answer lay buried inside years of pain. A brief flashback surfaced. Teenage Emily sitting alone in a foster home kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. A younger child crying quietly from a nightmare. The foster parents ignored him. Emily got up, comforted him, and sat beside him until he fell asleep. Even then, she had been the kind of person who carried other people's burdens while hiding her own. Back in the present, Henry's phone buzzed. It was Alexander. Coming by. Henry smiled slightly. Good. A few hours later, Alexander arrived, tall, confident, impeccably dressed. Everything about him reflected success. Employees straightened whenever he entered a room. Executives feared disappointing him. Financial markets reacted to his decisions. Yet despite his power, loneliness lingered beneath the surface. Years of betrayal had made him cautious. Years of people pursuing his money had taught him skepticism, a lesson his father understood all too well. As Alexander entered the room, Emily happened to be leaving. Neither was paying attention. They collided. The paper coffee cup in Emily's hand flew upward. Time seemed to slow. Coffee splashed directly across Alexander's custom-made suit. The room froze. Emily gasped. "Oh my God." Alexander stared down at the stain. Several seconds passed, then security rushed forward. "Sir." One guard immediately stepped between them. Another grabbed Emily's arm. "What are you doing?" Emily pulled away. "It was an accident." Guards weren't convinced. Years protecting billionaires had made them suspicious of everyone, particularly strangers. One guard narrowed his eyes. "You expect us to believe that it was an accident?" Alexander remained silent. A decision that would later haunt him. Emily looked directly at him. For one brief moment she hoped he would say something, anything. Instead, he simply stared. The silence hurt more than the accusation. The guards released her moments later, but the damage was done. Humiliation flooded her face. "I'm sorry for your suit." Then she turned and walked away. Henry watched everything. His disappointment was immediate. The moment the door closed, he looked at his son. "Well," Alexander frowned. "What? You couldn't defend her?" "I didn't know what happened." "You knew enough." Alexander sighed. "It was just an accident." "Exactly." The old man shook his head. "You judged her before you knew her." Criticism lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, Alexander found himself replaying the encounter. Something felt off. Most people who crossed paths with him reacted the same way: excitement, nervousness, recognition. Emily had shown none of those things. If anything, she seemed unimpressed. The realization intrigued him more than it should have. Elsewhere in Dallas, Emily sat alone outside a public library. She stared at the city lights while thinking about the encounter. Another wealthy person, another humiliating experience, another reminder that people like Alexander Whitmore lived in a completely different world. She didn't even know his name, only that he was important. What she couldn't know was that he was already thinking about her. At the same time, a separate chain of events was beginning to unfold. The wealthy woman who had accused Emily of stealing a bracelet returned to Brighton Jewelers. She appeared confident, relaxed, untouchable. Unfortunately for her, the store had recently upgraded its surveillance system. During a routine review, a security employee noticed something strange. The woman had removed the bracelet herself before entering the store. She had hidden it inside her purse, then falsely accused Emily. The footage left no room for doubt. The manager watched in disbelief. Guilt immediately followed. The memory of Emily's tear-filled eyes returned. The realization hit hard. He had destroyed an innocent person's livelihood, but Emily still didn't know. The truth was moving toward her slowly, inevitably, and when it arrived, it would expose more than a false accusation. It would reveal the kind of person she truly was. Back at the Whitmore estate, Vanessa received a report from a private investigator. She opened the folder. Inside was a photograph: Emily Carter. Vanessa stared at the image. A homeless orphan. No family, no wealth, no influence, no connections. At first glance, she appeared harmless. But Vanessa had learned never to underestimate people, particularly people who suddenly attracted Henry Whitmore's attention. She continued reading: hospital visits, frequent contact, growing friendship. The smile disappeared from Vanessa's face. A warning bell sounded in her mind. Henry was becoming attached. And attachment created risk. For the first time, she spoke Emily's name aloud. "Who exactly are you?" The investigator shifted nervously. "Should we continue looking into her?" Vanessa studied the photograph. A cold expression settled across her features. "Yes." "How deeply?" Vanessa's eyes hardened. "I want to know everything." That moment served as deep foreshadowing. The audience could already feel danger approaching, because Vanessa wasn't investigating out of curiosity. She was protecting what she believed belonged to her: the Whitmore fortune, the Whitmore name, the Whitmore future. And anyone she viewed as a threat would eventually become a target. Late that night, Henry sat alone in his hospital room reviewing documents. One document remained separate from the others, a draft prepared by his attorney. Henry looked at the paper for a long time, then folded it carefully. A thoughtful smile appeared. Outside the room, unseen by anyone, the future was quietly shifting. A homeless orphan had unknowingly captured the respect of a billionaire's father. A billionaire was beginning to question his first impression of her. A powerful fiancé was starting to view her as an enemy. And somewhere in a sealed folder sat a decision capable of destroying one of America's richest families. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. And when it did, nobody would leave unchanged.